like Julie and David Gorlewski. Julie and David Gorlewski are leaders in the field of English education and co-editors of the English Journal. Julie Gorlewski's academic interests stem from 14 years as an English language arts teacher in the Maryvale School District, and she also acted as department head. She was instrumental in expanding the district's reading program, online grading system, and coordinating the district's language arts program. Her book, Power, Resistance, and Literacy, Writing for Social Justice, won the 2011 Critics' Choice Award in the American Education Association. Before joining SUNY New Paltz, David served as Education Department Chair and the Director of the Doctoral Program at DeVille College. He wrote Making It Real, Case Studies for Secondary Teachers in 2012 with Julie. The Western New York Network of English Teachers and Buffalo State College are honored to present David and Julie Gorlewski.
The title of our talk tonight is Full Circle, Reflections on a Textual Revolution, which for those of us who are old enough to remember is a play on words. Textual was at one time sexual. So reflections on a textual revolution. And before we start talking about kind of the heart of our talk, we want to reiterate our gratitude for you being here tonight. I was a full-time teacher 5 years ago, and I fully remember what that schedule is like and can appreciate the effort, the passion, the integrity that you have to, at the end of a long day with your students, come here to interact with your colleagues, to try to think about our practice and reflect on it. So we can't thank you enough for being here today. Dave and I both earned our secondary English certification here at Buffalo State College many years ago, and feel like we've returned to our educational roots by being here. We were talking about how long it had been since we were in Ketchum and parked illegally the way Dave did. But this time we moved it, so it really is an honor and a dream come true to be here representing the National Council of Teachers of English and English Journal.
There you go.
Oh, yes. So we are really humbled by your being here tonight and hope to really have an engaging and interesting conversation with you. So the title of our talk, as I mentioned and as you saw a second ago, seeks to bring together the macro and the micro. When we think of revolution, we think of a big idea, generally, right? We think this is maybe analogous to the field of education as a whole, or to education reform even. We think of revolution as a big idea. But we don't see revolution necessarily as a massive, obliterating kind of change. Revolution, as we see it, can be composed of innumerable small, incremental changes that individuals on the ground can make. Mary Kennedy, who's a scholar and author, was recently asked to speak on a panel at an educational research convention, and the panel was entitled Bold New Ideas in Education. And Mary Kennedy thought about that for a little while and responded, "I'll be on the panel, but I'm against boldness." And that kind of echoes our idea. She didn't know she was echoing our thoughts, but she was. On the other hand, we tend to think of text as small and concrete, right? Even though we know it can change the world, it's something we can get our hands on. This we think of as analogous to the daily work of teachers and students in classrooms. So how do we connect these ideas, right? Text and evolution. Well, we think that the small, concrete, daily interactions of teachers and students have the potential to create revolution. The question, of course, and what you're hoping we can answer today, is how? How do we shift from being or feeling like pawns in a system to being active participants in a transformational process? Which is really the promise of education and why we got into this field to begin with, right? We propose an answer of sorts, and it is that evolution plus reflection can lead to revolution.
This is the outline for our program today. We picked these three images because they represent what we're going to be talking about and also the way we see things. We selected the teacher who's pointing at you because we believe that you have the personal agency, that you can summon the personal agency to make change in your classroom, because that's where the change takes place. The second thing is kind of like an indoor trap. We believe, as Julie said, that change is continuous. We don't become, like just good teachers. We're continuously becoming teachers. We're continuously learning new things and sharing those with our students. And the last thing I'll talk about in terms of education reform is this idea of a pendulum. It always it bothered me as an educator when I'd hear about reforms, and I'd hear my colleagues say, this too shall pass. It's a pendulum, it came and it went. I'd like to talk about that a little bit with some of the literature reviews that I've done.
Theory into practice, case stories for school leaders begins with this statement. Teaching, learning, and leading are all acts of love. This, of course, is not a new idea, but it's an idea that we really believe in. And an idea that's worth reminding ourselves of. An idea that you almost never hear from school reformers. We think it's important, however. Being a teacher, becoming a teacher, begins with the understanding ourselves and seeing ourselves as connected to things that are outside of and larger than ourselves, right? We know this. In our experience, people don't become teachers strictly on the basis of their own needs. They become educators on the basis of the needs of the people they care about, right? Family, friends, colleagues, students, our community, our democracy, our world, even. We become teachers to advocate for those whom we love as much as or more than we love ourselves. Teaching, therefore, is rooted in love. We love our profession. We love the ideal and the realities of education. We love our students, even those whom we don't always like very much. But perhaps most importantly, we love the promise of the future, the promise of democracy, and the promise of working with young people who will in turn be constructing a future that they imagine. A future that we will also reside in someday as well, if you need a personal connection or reason. Our actions as educators are grounded in the belief that it's an educator's duty, a teacher's duty, to prepare students to live in and to construct a world that does not yet exist. Our role is to prepare learners to negotiate and construct this world, a world that is as yet unimagined. Therefore, in a very real sense, educators' work is not for ourselves. Ethically, morally, and materially, our focus is the future. It is the young people with whom we're working. And if teaching is a political act, then certainly learning is a political act as well. All of these ideas are missing from some of the reform movements that we're dealing with and that Jim and Shannon talked about. So if any teacher who enters a classroom is engaged in a political act, then all teaching is political. Therefore, it's really important to reflect on these questions. What kind of world are we helping our students construct? In the process, what identities are we cultivating and obliterating? And how are we and our students imagining the future? The teaching is political whether or not we understand it as such. That's why it's so important to uncover the assumptions on which we're acting and with which we're interacting with our students. Transformative, revolutionary teaching requires that, and it takes time and effort. It's really hard. So in considering our work, we have to wonder, what are we imagining about teaching and learning? This first image here on the left is from the Matrix, kind of a chilling image. And when I think of some of the standardization that is happening in schools, it reminds me of this. On the other hand, the other image reminds me of a collaborative, co-constructed world. And think for a second about how you imagined your work, how you imagined your career when you began as a teacher. Which side of this would you fall on, and which side would our students fall on when they think about their education today? Yeah, is this what you imagined when you started thinking of a teacher? Not what I imagined. So I said earlier that becoming a teacher begins with understanding ourselves. And as teachers, we can all appreciate the effectiveness of beginning with what we know. We start with our students, what they know and what we know. In that spirit, I try to put this quote in every presentation I do because it's one of my all-time favorite quotes by James Moffat. And he says, "I remember a dedication in a book I have forgotten. It read, 'To so-and-so, who taught me what I know.' No, it didn't read that. My cliche-ridden mind read that. I looked again. Who taught me that I know? Who taught me that I know?" And Jim continues, "What I know that's of use to you is that you know. Sweeping aside the intervening clutter, recall yourself as a young learner. Then review those learners in front of you. You know, but you must assume the power to do what you know." So what do we know? We can't care or we can't act until we know. So we have to ensure that we do know, and we have to remind ourselves of what we know, particularly as state, federal, and corporate entities seek to subvert, silence, and deny what we know. Here is what we know. You know yourself, you know your students, you know your content, and you know the social context in which you are working. And critical reflection, we would argue, on each of these can offer fresh perspectives on what we already know.
I'd like to talk a little bit about text and reform. While I was thinking about it, you know, when you go in an airplane and they talk about the plane losing pressure, you should put the oxygen mask on yourself first if you have a child with you. And I think of an organization like the Western New York Network of English Teachers, which would serve as the oxygen that you need to put on yourself first. Because as hard as it is to get out here, I think you need each other to, so that you know you're not crazy. Education. We were at the Florida Council of Teachers of English just last week, and that was a common thing that we heard when we had a similar presentation, was that, you know, I'm not alone. Other people are thinking this way. Other people recognize the craziness that's going on with school reform. So I'd like to talk a little bit about text and school reform. Education has always been evolving, and the concept of the purpose of education has been evolving. So that is not something that has started recently. Now we do know that the recent purpose of education, as pronounced in the State of the Union by our president, is that we need to create students who are college and career ready. And so to that statement, Julie and I have posed other questions. We asked, what college, what curriculum, what career, what profession? Because the answer to that question would change the level or the type of readiness that the president speaks about. I see Dennis Vitazik back there, my colleague, former colleague from West Seneca West High School, where I taught English for 14 years.
Right next door, right next door.
So Dennis and I were there when the English department, I think for the first time, it was 1980, Dennis, we sat down and there was a standardized test that we had to read and grade using rubrics and all that for the first time, 1980. And it was a shocking experience because, you know, Dennis and I came up at a time where there was still a lot of grammar book usage, vocabulary, lists, things like that. And over time, you know, we began to see things a little bit differently, but the writing at that time was not good, despite the fact that we were burdening kids with concepts of correctness instead of reaching into their context and their world and seeing what they could. And I was in this building where one of the professors, I wrote he told us to write anything you want to write about, so I wrote about some pretentious concept like the American teenager, I think it was. And at the end, he gives me like a C- and says, why don't you write about something you really know about? And so, and I forgot that some of the mundane things that I wrote about, but I realized that I had the power, I had the personal agency to write about those things. I knew about them. And my essays were much more, they're much better developed, and it was something I cared about, as opposed to picking something esoteric or maybe too broad. You know, I wasn't a sociologist. I had no right to really write about that. I had, you know. So anyway, thinking about school reform, the standards movement began in the 80s. It hit New York State. States like Vermont and Pennsylvania were among the first to enter into this standardized testing, but it was done on a much smaller scale. Some states had portfolios, like Vermont. Others, like New York State, had selected, you know, we had standardized testing for like grades, for let's say 5 and 8 for writing, 5, 8, and 11. It was pretty narrow. Math would be like grade 6. So it was depending on, you know, what subject and what grade. Extensive, at that time we had extensive debates, and you could almost call them mini holy wars, on how to teach reading, how to teach writing. I was in this building when Charles Cooper from the University of Buffalo talked about writing process, and he showed us two exact, I don't know if you read that Saturday morning thing, Dennis, but he showed us two pieces of writing, and we looked at it and he said, read them both, you know, which one's better? One was very sloppy, hard to follow. The other was neatly typed. So I thought it's got to be a trick. You know, the sloppy one's better. You know, the joke was on us. They were both the same exact paper. But it did show how we looked at things like neatness, and it kind of hovered in our head. The point here is that it was a local discussion. We came here voluntarily, and we went back to West Seneca, and we talked about how we can help our students. You know, are we overdoing it with a red pen? You know, are we killing with grammar and spelling and things like that? It was a local discussion. We also had discussions on tracking and ability grouping. Dennis is part of that too in West Seneca. We detracked West Seneca, we detracked the Maryvale school district. Again, this was a local decision. We thought about it, talked about it, read about it, and then we made those changes. Gene Oakes was a leader in tracking and ability grouping research. However, with No Child Left Behind, the discussion became at the federal level, and it became top-down. And that's where testing and threats became infused in the discussion. Then, with Race to the Top, this had become No Child Left Behind on steroids. And many people argue that what is being done is beyond the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution says that the state is in charge of education, not the federal government. Now, the Common Core State Standards, even though it says state in it, is a misnomer, because the state didn't create it. The state, in a sense, bought it or adopted it through coercion. And that document was, originally it was a National Governors Association, and I believe it was a consortium of chief state school officers, CCSSO. They came together, they approved it, and then in a sense, they sold it to the states. If you wanted to get the federal money, you had to adopt the Common Core. Now this whole thing, as we see it, is like the banking model of education. It's focusing on what kids don't know, the standardized testing, the focuses on you know, it's competitive, it's individualistic. It doesn't account for the social context. It doesn't honor children's, families, traditions, cultures. You know, it's a one-size-fits-all. And you know, and you guys are the ones carrying the cross of this thing every single day. So the early reforms that I talked about, that Dennis and I were involved in, it was our call, and we wanted to make, and it was energizing to be part of it, and to see detracking and see Regents' diploma rates go up. You know, no one made us do it. We saw that it was best for kids. We saw the flaw, we corrected it, and now it's again all a very top-down approach. Take a look here. I guess this would be the big question right here. There's President Obama, Bill Gates. This is John King, the New York State Commissioner of Education. We've had our lucky couple meetings with him. And of course, Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education. So it's accountability based, immediacy and objectivity. The objectivity, my colleagues in the social foundations of education refer to it as a return of, yeah, that's right. It's, they refer to it as positivism, and this is a resurgent, so they call it resurgent positivism. Julie and I have access to like 104 years of English Journal. We have hard copies.
That's one of the perks. We don't get to keep them, but we get to store them for 5 years.
So it's a remarkable, it's to page through a journal from 1921 or 1918. And among the things was, one article was, are high school students ready for Shakespeare? It was one of the articles that was written. Another article was, what is the role of the English teacher in Americanizing our students? That was around 1915, 1916. You can see sir, all these, you know, Eastern, Southern, Europeans are coming in, and there's a lot of them, and we're going to have to do something. This is a problem, you know. But you can see that was the talk back then. And same discussions occur today, 100 years later.
Mm-hmm. So what we talked about earlier was this idea of moving to revolution. Evolution plus reflection can lead to revolution, right? So we're going to talk a tiny bit about change theory, or how not to get like smacked in the head by the pendulum on its way back into our context. This, we would argue, is kind of how we feel now, right? As teachers, we're being affected, influenced, oppressed perhaps even by the social context in which we're working, where we don't feel like we have enough control. On the other hand, we are also desperately attempting to meet the needs of our learners, who we would think are most important. So this would be like how we would argue, this is evolution. Evolution looks like there's nobody behind it, right? It's just happening and we're just being buffeted along as it happens in that river. This more colorful slide is how we would like to see our work, right? Transformation is a result of all of us working together, understanding, of course, that teachers and learners are part of the context, are part of the social context, deserve to have a voice in that context. So we have to think about, in this process, at least a little bit, how things change, theories of change. Most theories of change have three elements. Planned actions, which you can imagine, if you think about the reforms we're involved in now, there certainly are planned actions that are sequenced. However, what is not addressed typically in change theory are the set of assumptions that underpin the selection and sequence of the actions. And that is the assumptions of both those who are in charge of the change and those who are on a macro level, and those of us who are in charge of change on a more micro level, on a more text-based level, right? So change theory, we know change only gets results, real results, when it is in the hands and hearts and minds of the people who have deep knowledge. And you already know who we think those people are, right? That's you. Michael Fullen indicates when you're thinking about change, and this is just to give you an idea of why you feel like you're crazy sometimes, why these changes are not working in our classrooms the way it's claimed that they might. You can't mandate what matters. We know that, and it's true. And change theory proves that. Change is a journey, not a blueprint. You can't predict where you're going. There's a map, but sometimes you'll end up someplace where you did not expect. Problems are our friends. So when we think about critical reflection on dilemmas we face in the classroom, and thinking about dilemmas as opportunities rather than things that continue to oppress us, will help us function in these challenging times. And finally, connection with a wider environment is critical for success. So groups like this, key to change that is transformative rather than oppressive. Every person is a change agent and can be a change agent. Evolution as natural and top-down and institutional affects students and learners rather than being affected by them. That was a joke, the English teacher joke I think. So evolution is when we're affected by rather than effecting change. There are so few audiences in which we can use this. Nowhere else on the planet could we do this. So thank you. Thank you for that. So the other problem with evolution from a Darwinian perspective, right? What evolution is connected with survival of the fittest. We don't do that work. We don't do survival of the fittest work. We're about collaboration and community and education for change and common purposes, right? So what do all these ideas mean for teachers today, right? How do we move from the idea of evolution to revolution? Well, we have an idea. We have a micro idea, a small idea, and a text-based idea. And that is critical reflection using something we call the expand model. And Jim has some handouts for us. What we're going to do now is we're going to stop talking and let you do some reading. What we have here are, oh, you can explain that.
Yeah, I've used this approach just this past weekend with a group of future educational administrators who are taking courses at SUNY New Paltz. And it's a way to create it's kind of a template for reflection.
Oh, thank you.
And it's a way to slow down the decision-making process by thinking things through more deeply. So before you look at that, maybe just take a look up here. We just call it, the acronym is EXPAND. And what we ask the students to do is we give them a situation, a story, and all the stories that we have created are based on real events. We just change the names and modify the story a bit. And we create a dilemma for either future teachers or for future administrators. We ask them to briefly explain the story in their own words so we know that they understand it. And then we ask them to look at the situation in the story from different perspectives. If there are three different people, let's say a principal, assistant principal, and the teacher, how are they seeing what's going on? You know, one feels wrong, but the other one feels wrong for a different reason. Then we ask them to look at the assumptions that undergird or support their perspective. You know, I think we should do this to this kid, but why? What's my philosophy or belief about discipline that makes me want to say that? Then we ask these future teachers or future administrators to tell us what's not there. What information do you wish you had to make you make a better decision? So that you're not making a quick decision on the spot, you're saying, I wish I had access to this document or folder or policy statement or contract or something. You know, I wish I could talk to the kid's father, or I wish I could do, you know, whatever. What's not there that we didn't put in the story? And then after that, we would ask you to think of what you would do next. Again, most people go from experiencing the story to coming up with a quick decision. We're trying to illustrate that.
When you're done reading, partner up with someone else next to you who's also done reading and just talk through the 5 points of the expanse framework. And then we'll have a very brief group discussion, and we just have 2 more slides, so we're almost done. That was gonna rain, 10 minutes.
The perspective of the teacher, we'd like to handle that one. How does the teacher see the situation? Yes, yes, sir.
She feels that the Native American culture is being addressed in the introduction and early on in the text. She feels that I guess should satisfy the student.
Yeah, that I would agree with. Anybody disagree with that? That the teacher feels she's doing her job, that she's actually quite enlightened? You know, she's looked into this?
Or maybe an expansion of the, even if you agree, what else might you say about the perspectives of the teacher?
It might be changing, she might realize something about the text they picked that she hadn't considered.
Yeah, it becomes like an eye-opening situation. How about the perspective of the student?
I think the student sees it as if her entire culture is being represented in this tiny piece of a really big book. And like how she says that, according to the book, Native Americans are gone after 1620, just like a little, well, definitely offended. Maybe thinks that it's a little more fluid than that.
How about perspectives regarding the relationship? The relationship with the student and the teacher? And we'll talk about that with your partner.
The relationship between the two. Well, this lady here that I was speaking to talked about the needing to know more about that. She had it under the not there thing. Although the story indicated that she had had that teacher the previous school year. They hadn't solved this. We had the same kid 2 years in a row. Often you have a pretty good relationship.
And I feel like if the teacher is comfortable enough, it states twice in here, like that they're kind of joking. She tries to make it sort of like loosey-goosey fun for the student. So there's like some sort of comfortable relationship where it's not totally.
Right, yeah, using humor to diffuse the situation. Yeah, under what assumptions are the two operating? Let's go with the teacher first of all.
She's assuming defiance. It says an uncharacteristic defiance on the part of the student.
So
So
what
not in
part-
compliance.
Right.
So
So
in non-compliance
yeah.
from a student she thought she knew well.
Yeah, yeah. And she hit a nerve with this kid.
This is the kid who typically complies, and all of a sudden is not complying, and the teacher is thrown off by that.
Yeah, you can really be taken aback by that. It surprises you, the type of negativity. And it's like, I thought I knew you. I thought we were friends.
Right.
Anybody else?
There might also be an assumption by the teacher that since I've had this prior relationship with the student and she knows me, she knows that I wouldn't do something like this to offend her. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
you know I wouldn't do this to you. Why are you getting upset?
Yeah.
You know, not like that.
Yeah. That's good. And what we could add?
I like this kind of student. I just talked with my colleagues. Sometimes as instructors, our students come into the room, oftentimes, at least 50% of them, ready to conform to whatever the teacher is going to
Yeah.
be regurgitating that day. And I like this kind of student because this type of student will oftentimes, engage other students in interesting conversation and move forward.
Right, so the assumption that she is defying you by questioning your text, I think is really an important one.
Yeah. And as Julie said earlier, problems are our friends, and then the teacher, hopefully she'll embrace that and move forward. Any other assumptions that you think are operative here?
It seems like the teacher thinks she marked off like a cultural checklist, sort of, by reading that sentence in the introduction. Thinks all her bases are covered.
That's a good, cultural checklist, I think. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. You know, I like that she assumes her jokes are funny. That's really important. Like, understanding of her level of communication with the student that she's missing, really missing.
Yeah.
Another assumption which, I'm sorry, everything I think brought up was the student is assuming there really isn't anything for her in this text because there's nothing about Native Americans after 16, 20 or whatever it was, you know, rather than assuming maybe there's some broader human themes that she can connect to.
Yeah.
So it kind of shifts us to the students' perspectives. Other ideas about what the students' perspectives are here?
Or the assumptions.
Assumptions, sorry.
That there won't be any sort of supplemental text along with this anthology that will maybe allow her to see herself in the material.
Yeah, it's like there's a sense from her that it's a done deal, that there's nothing I can do about this, you know. What do you wish what's not there you wish you knew? People you could question, stuff you could look at? Yes, sir.
I would like to know how many other students felt the same way that never spoke.
Yeah. Good one, yeah. Yes.
I would like to know, it seems that the level of hostility seems a little out of proportion, maybe, that she's bringing in, you know, feelings and, you know, has maybe been just a little bit in the past because of the background and is bringing a little of that in.
Yeah, she comes across as strident.
Yeah.
But again, that's our
Yeah.
perspective, and she, I'm sure, may see herself as much more idealistic or what's fair, equitable, you know. Yes?
I'm just thinking that I would like to know what's going on with this student, like from a social worker's perspective or a counselor's perspective, because she's reaching out, she wants to read about problems, she's got problems, things are going on with her. So I think finding out that is definitely something
Yeah.
that.
I guess not to negate the Native American situation, but to, there might very well be, sure.
I'd like to know, like, what she likes to read. If she self-selects text, does she pick things that she sees herself reflected in, or more mainstream things that are popular?
Anything else?
I feel like I'd like to know what cultural backgrounds make up the other 80% of the school, if 20% is Native American.
And that would be kind of a good, you know, as a problem-solving situation in the school. That'd be, you know, you get a committee of people together, you can investigate something like this and really make a change in the school. There's a hand up here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to know what the teacher did about it. I
Well,
want to know.
maybe you can jump on the do next.
Well, these are some of the things I think led really nicely to it, the idea that a question that leads to teacher inquiry, that leads to maybe a class project that says, okay, let's investigate what kinds of, what do you want to read, what's in this textbook, how do we interrogate this textbook, how do we take this dilemma, because we know that the work of teachers involves thousands of decisions every day, and that's not an exaggeration. And every time we make a decision where we're facing a dilemma, I mean, we can't do this every time, but the ones that really keep us up at night, this kind of framework can help us think through in a proactive way and think about what to do next, which is, I think, where those two questions are taking us.
So what should the teacher do next?
What might?
What should
There's not an answer key, remember? On the 4, 3, 2, 1 response.
She should have a conference with the student. She should have a conference with the student, a meeting with the students.
Yeah, one-on-one.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't even have asked her a question in front of the class. Just kind of moved on and said, we'll have a chat.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, again, that's a decision on your part too. It's, not now. You know, we draw a line now, later.
I'll also comment on something that was mentioned about supplemental material. I explained to my group that in every unit that I create I always allow at least an opportunity for the students to choose a piece of literature that they will bring to the table and synthesize in some way or another with the literature that I've supplied for them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's
I will let
important.
the student know that you will get your opportunity to share your literature, but for now you read mine.
Yeah. So you can see that happening in this situation.
Correct.
Someone
I
else?
think,
I don't know, I think she's feeling invalidated already. And I think part of like the steps to make that student feel validated would be to bring that up to the entire class. I mean, she already feels like she doesn't have a voice, right? You've been handed a textbook. I don't know if like a one-on-one conversation or like, oh, we'll do this later, like let me make some jokes and we'll just talk about it later. Like she's bringing up a valid point because she already feels like she's not part of this class or the school. We don't have that context, and I think it should be brought up to everyone immediately to make her feel like she's important.
So the power, part of the power of using this framework, particularly in writing, which is how we like to use it, because all of the things that when we write critical incidents or case stories, as we sometimes call them, they're written out, and they have tremendous power in terms of thinking through our practice and raising different ways to address issues, and in collaboration they're even better. But I'll just give you two quick examples. One was when I was teaching 11th grade English using this very anthology that was referred to here. It had in it two things that were problematic for my 11th grade students. One of them was sets of ellipses in a short story called The Sniper. There were ellipses in there, obviously something was missing, so I went online to find out what was missing. And what was missing was at one point, Christ, I'm hit, when the sniper was hit. And at another point, he felt the pain of 1,000 devils in his arm. And both of those were cut from the original, which didn't really bother my students, but it bothered me. So, in thinking through how to, and reflecting on this problem, I came up with a class activity of writing letters to the publisher, where we first did some research on censorship and things like that, and then they wrote letters to the publisher on their opinion. And the publisher wrote a lovely letter back, which had an interesting censorship angle later in that. I wrote about it in an article for English Journal called Christ and Cleavage, and I'll get to the cleavage in a minute. And writing the article, I wanted to quote this lovely letter that the publisher sent back to my students, but her lawyers wouldn't let them publish her letter. And our principal wouldn't let our students include their names on their letters. So it's really kind of an interesting whole censorship thing. The cleavage part was the same, the 9th grade version of that textbook had a picture of Juliet from the 1968 Zeffirelli film leaning over the balcony, and in the original film, which my student teacher happened to put it still up on the bulletin board of, she has cleavage. And in the book, they had airbrushed her chest. So that was another thing that they wrote about. So I think these were issues that initially it can be hard to respond to, but in reflecting on them, it can make it easier. And I'll just give you one more example of how this works in writing. And that is, Dave and I wrote a book of case stories for secondary teachers, and we had to address 10 different standards for teachers. One of them was, I think it was community involvement. But anyway, I had to think of an example of that. Almost all the examples come from our real practice. The example I chose was a veteran teacher.
I think it was a school culture, creating a school culture.
Could be, yeah. So it was a veteran teacher who is having lunch in his room, and a 3-year teacher, someone who's been there 3 years, who he has been mentoring, comes into the classroom and says, hey, what are you doing having lunch here? I wanted to talk to you, da, da, da. And we were having lunch, and you didn't hear about so-and-so just had a baby, and so-and-so just did. And he said, oh, I almost never have lunch in the faculty room. And so she presses him on it and says, why? And he talks about how the negative comments in the faculty room, the negative conversation in the faculty room, had a negative effect on his interactions with his students. And he actually noticed that after lunch in the faculty room, he was more judgmental of students and families and parents. And so I wrote the story, and one of the things with the critical incidents is that they have to be a real dilemma. There cannot be a villain and a hero. There cannot be a perspective of someone who is just wrong and needs to be corrected. I had a really hard time with that story because I was that teacher who had lunch in my classroom all the time. I didn't go to the faculty room, and to me, like, that was obviously the right thing to do, so I wasn't infected by the faculty room culture. And it probably took me about 3 weeks of ruminating on this dilemma to come up with the perspectives and assumptions that made it a real dilemma. And that was, so at the end of the story, what I have the young teacher doing is saying to the veteran teacher, how can you have lunch in your room? You have an obligation to go to that faculty room and try to change the conversation. You are respected here, and you have a voice and you have a knowledge base you should be sharing. My point of this is, and it was too late for me, I was already out of my secondary classroom, so it's just a point of failure in my resume. But the point being that writing about these and thinking about them critically has much more power to change our own assumptions than we might give it credit for. And that's part of the reason we are big believers in the case story method or critical incident method, the EXPAND framework. So to come full circle, we believe that critical reflection, which enables us to understand teaching as an ongoing series of decisions, gives us the best avenue toward continuous becoming, which we believe that education is. Not a revolution as a massive event, but as something that is ongoing. We like the EXPAND framework. It's text, it's incident, it's critical, it's stories, and it gives us a critical perspective, and it always focuses on questions which lead us forward, not answers which stop us. The answers are only somewhat helpful. And we also believe in change. Change that is done with students, not to students, and that involves questioning our own assumptions on a constant, ongoing basis. That's what we believe. We believe that education does not exist to, this is back to our initial thesis, in case you forgot. Education does not exist to prepare students to be workers in a corporate state. Education exists to create a democracy in which we all collaborate to create a better world. We believe that individuals can be agents of change, and that together we have greatest possibility for solidarity and for doing what's best for us, for our students, and for our future as yet unimagined world. That's us together. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.